Bienvenidos y bienvenido a episodio 7, episode 7 of the Airways podcast. I'm Rohan Anand, your co-host, along with
Helwing. Thank
Vinay
you for
Bhaskara.
that Spanish. I think we should do a Spanish version of a Spanish speaking episode.
Claro que
You and
sí,
I.
somos bilingües. I'd like to also thank
Oh,
American
yeah.
Airlines for sponsoring, not really today's video, but if you ever go to their swag store, they have some pretty nice apparel that you can see on here. I got this fleece. It's really cozy. I got this coloring book that I had delivered just in time for Christmas. So my nephews have already gone to town. If you can see right here, that's great. And I decided to have a celebratory mocktail, cocktail, whatever you want to call it. And this one is actually courtesy of United Airlines with their Moonlighter Vodka Spritz or Vermouth, something like that. I think it's buy on board, but salud, Helwing, for another wonderful year and season of Airways podcast.
Cheers, cheers. Ching,
That
ching.
looks lovely. So I'm coming from Dallas, Texas, and something interesting that I found out, and this is kind of a segue into our topics for 2025, but really from a loyalty perspective, American Airlines has been very generous with a status offer. And I have United Gold that's expiring basically in the next few days because I didn't travel as much for work this year. And so work travel has me taking me to Texas a good amount. And as someone based out of Chicago, I'm going to take advantage of the American Airlines status match challenge. So I'm going to start flying American again for a little while. And I think that maybe one of the things that we can think about and what we expect for this 2025 recap episode, but also what we look forward to in 2026 is American Airlines going to get its groove back? And is it going to become, once again, a three airlines that are top tier premium in the United States, and will Southwest Airlines be the number 4 discount person, and then Spirit and Frontier, will they merge, and along with Allegiant be ultra low cost? So many things to talk about, so many things to look forward to.
Yeah, I mean, I think they probably, I don't know if they have. If you do, please, American Airlines, we do kind of say, hey, what's happening, man? What is happening? Why are you lagging? But then again, they came out with this announcement that they're going to push out 16 new routes out of DFW for spring next year. So, hey, maybe they're going to get their group back next year.
Yeah. Being in DFW for the last couple of weeks, and I'll be here for much of the first quarter of 2026, it is uncanny how the city of Dallas and Dallas-Fort Worth Airport is giving like 2012 era Chicago O'Hare in terms of the growth, all the international volume that's coming in. Routes like Dublin and Rome and double daily to Madrid happening in December, something we would have never thought possible 15 years ago. Turkish Airlines flying a 777-300ER. Qantas. My gosh, I was out at a bar a couple nights ago and I met up with a bunch of Qantas cabin crew that were on layover because they have an A380 coming in daily from Sydney, and then they have a 4-time weekly flight from Melbourne. You got Fiji, you got EVA, Cathay Pacific, Air France. The list goes on. Dallas is big. And I asked my mom in the last hour, what are your biggest wishes for 2026? And as a Dallas-based flyer for American, which he and my dad have been for almost 40 years, they're very loyal to the airline. However, they're very frustrated too as a kind of hub captive in Dallas. And my mom was saying, the one thing I wish is that the aircraft reliability and dispatch for American will get better. I'm sick of getting on the plane, pushing back, and then having to return to the gate, for whatever reason. And DFW Airport in and of itself is going to be such a huge area of focus with the growth, the Terminal F developments and the construction, how American wants DFW to basically become like Atlanta, but also that comes with those really negatory consequences. You're growing from like 8 to 13 banks. You're going to have a much more centralized choke point if there is some sort of weather issue that happens all the time in Texas, or there's some sort of ATC issues because that problem's not going away. And then not to mention, the reliability of new aircraft. Like they brought in this 787-9 that's getting all the oohs and ahs. However, there were those teething problems that happened at the beginning. And, there's been some teething and other issues with the Airbus A321 XLR, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
Yeah, correct. And it's interesting you're saying that I'm glad to hear that DFW is looking into upgrading the infrastructure. I mean, you hear that a lot about, Northeast airports like JFK's Terminal 6, and that's all in the news. I've never been to Dallas, so I would love to go there and see what's happening um, there, because I spoke with the general manager for the Americas for Finnair, and he spoke really, really nice about Dallas, and how that's a destination that they like to fly to. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I would love to go.
DFW Airport is the premier one world hub. It is not Narita, it is not Hong Kong, Sydney, Heathrow, LAX, New York, Chicago. It is Dallas Fort Worth. And I think that will continue to be a trend and a theme for the coming years. And taking it back a direction to our top 2025 storylines, I think that we can begin the year by discussing American Airlines and the crash that took place in early January, the DCA mid-air collision. And that was followed by the Air India 787 crash, the Jeju Air crash, the Delta CRJ 900 crash in Toronto that literally inverted the aircraft, the UPS crash that took place. And so, where are we seeing regulation? And how are we addressing some of these issues that we're having?
Yes. So as you can hear, our dear listeners, we are going to tackle the top 2025 storylines that we've covered. And that, I think that's very, I mean, that comes first in our minds, just a major safety incident. And it was a strange start of the year for sure. A new administration came in the U.S., and then all these things started happening in D.C. So yeah, I don't know what's your take on it.
I personally don't have any idea. I am very, I guess, I'm very lost as a consumer, as someone that is passionate about, aviation safety. I'm lost in terms of where the circle connects between manufacturing, supply chains, global geopolitical issues, safety systems, Spirit Air Systems, along with Boeing, staffing shortages, near misses, ATC
Yeah,
communications with pilots. There seems to be a story almost every week where there is literally documented on like Vyasa Aviation or Vasa Aviation or some other websites that have a recording of a pilot interacting with ATC, and there's a near miss issue or there's a language barrier issue. And I have some friends that work in the tower at O'Hare, and they mentioned some of the foreign airlines that come in that give them pause for concern, especially some of the ones that fly in really late at night or early in the morning when it's heavy in winter in Chicago, and there's gaps in familiarity. So I don't have an answer for that, Vinay.
I mean, I think there is sort of a generalized kind of brittleness that has permeated a bunch of different aspects of aviation, right? And you called out a lot of them in your sort of preamble there, right? Everything from um, how sort of aircraft deliveries and seat deliveries and interior configuration has been held up by supply chain issues, to how air traffic control and ATC infrastructure and airport infrastructure has been sort of held back by supply chain issues. I think fundamentally, right, the flow of people, goods, and services, and kind of the supply chains that sit underneath those, were fundamentally broken by COVID, and people rushed back to provide the same amount of, like, I guess, output or capacity in many cases, without having the same type of staffing and resourcing that sits behind it. And that could be sort of resourcing of raw materials, that could be resourcing of sort of expertise, or that could be resourcing of just literal heads, literal sort of raw butts and seats to staff air traffic control towers, or certification efforts at the FAA, so on and so forth, right? So I think they're all linked in a way. You're right to kind of call that out. I do think it is worth, as always, I feel like this is my role whenever we talk about safety, to call out that on an objective level, aviation remains by far one of the safest things that you can do. Literally, per unit of time, it is safer to fly on a commercial aircraft in the United States than it is to go for a swim in your swimming pool, right? So like like in a backyard swimming pool, right? So on some level, while the trend line is rough and the trend line is adverse and the trend line is unacceptable in some ways. In absolute numbers, we have like 1/100th the type of safety risks, even at this elevated level, as was just naturally accepted in the 60s or in the 70s, right? So just pretty fundamentally, I think like things are getting worse, but it's still objectively a very safe base. And that's usually kind of where I land whenever someone asks like, oh, is flying safe? Is air travel safe? So on.
Yeah.
I think that's interesting. So it's like the tail end of COVID. So it's like, we kind of forget that COVID happened and it had an effect on all of society in terms of operations, staffing, and whatnot. Okay, it's interesting, but there will
Yeah.
be obviously like an improvement in safety, or at least a more focused attention on safety coming next
We
year,
always
I
want to,
hope.
yeah, we
But
always want to hope
it
for
always
better.
happens, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's how the industry evolves. It's more insight, right, and then more oversight, I guess. Hopefully,
Yeah. And I think that, we began season uh 9 by saying, geopolitical events have returned with that vengeance, right? And kind of continuing along that theme, we have the ongoing issue with runway expansion in the UK, right? The Gatwick versus Heathrow, how that will take place. I think another thing that we saw was the Pakistan airspace closure, which it just makes me LOL that, like, for the longest time, Air India had this advantage of being able to overfly Russian aerospace to be able to go nonstop between high volume, high growth markets, India and US, and the issues with Pakistan basically obliterated that advantage. Flights from San Francisco to Bengaluru and Mumbai were having to go through Kolkata, and then now they've been axed and they will all have to just be routed through Delhi again, which is, also kind of like Dallas just blowing up, in terms of growth. Um, but it's going to just benefit the Middle Eastern Airlines and Turkish Airlines as well, with that. And along those lines, Pakistan airspace closure and new airports, secondary airports in tier one cities in India, opening up like Navi Mumbai, which we've talked about on this podcast for almost 10 years now. The possibility of a Noida airport in Delhi. Vinay, your thoughts on those?
Well, there is a Noida airport, right? It's opening in 2027 or 2026, I think is the current plan for the Noida airport, right? I think it is interesting, right? When you think about sort of like what's been happening in Indian aviation, honestly, frankly, the closure of Pakistani airspace is probably just the tip of the iceberg, right? There were much sort of bigger stories and much bigger sort of pain points that emerged throughout the year, whether it was the sort of Air India crash, right? That happened kind of in quick succession, sort of after some of those US crashes, right? The Air India 77 that crashed in Ahmedabad in June, or whether it was, frankly, Indigo's pretty stunning meltdown towards the end of the year. That, to me, truthfully, is probably the biggest story in Indian aviation, right? Pakistani airspace, maybe on the margins, it impacts sort of like some of the long haul flight connections that are possible into and out of India. And it's specifically really an issue for Air India, right? Like that's really the main sort of victim of that. But ultimately, it doesn't have that many downstream impacts because US airlines, European airlines can still use Pakistani airspace. The bigger thing is really the what's been happening with Indigo. And the thing that's fascinating, right, is the way this story has been sort of played in the Western press has kind of framed it purely as sort of like a meltdown, right? But if you read the local Indian press, there's at least an undercurrent, if not explicit agreement, that part of what was happening there was Indigo was trying to use its leverage, the fact that it controls, something like 60% of the Indian market, to push back on pilot staffing rules that it wasn't a fan of that would have fundamentally broken its cost or reshaped its cost base. Since I'd broken, but it would have fundamentally elevated Indigo's cost base to have sort of stronger and stricter rest limits for pilots. Indigo was not a fan of this proposed regulation. They made that displeasure known, and lo and behold, the regulation goes into effect. Indigo has a quote unquote meltdown where it doesn't have enough pilots to staff its operation. Maybe there's a part of that was genuine, But now all of a sudden, the introduction of those pilot rest rules and those crew rest rules and the limitations on overnight flying, all of which is very common in India, right? Working your pilots to the bone, flying overnight sectors throughout 24-hour operations. All of that is very common in India. And so I think the fascinating thing is I feel like the broader sort of press has misunderstood, I think, what's happening, right? There's at least there's a serious belief within Indian aviation circles that Indigo's quote unquote meltdown was actually an intentional chess move to leverage the government to get rid of regulation that it wasn't a fan.
There will always be this tension between the government of India and Indian Airlines, and to a degree in which the lack of transparency, just again, another LOL comment. In Air India's case, there are a lot of people that feel that, yes, while the airline is, owned now by TATA, there is still the added element that Singapore Airlines has plenty of influence in the airline, particularly because Singapore Airlines also had Vistara that it's brought to the table. And with Indigo, my confusion level is the long haul aspect on non narrow body aircraft, wet leasing or dry leasing from Turkish Airlines and from like Norwind Airlines or some other random ones so that they can fly to Manchester or they can fly literally back to back wingtip flights with Turkish from Istanbul to Delhi and Istanbul to Mumbai. My mom was flying Turkish from Istanbul to Delhi and she accidentally showed up at the Indigo gate because it's a 777-300 that is painted in Indigo colors with the Turkish Airlines number. Like, is Turkey and Turkey involved, with Indigo in this realm? And I'm not trying to sound like, India is a monolithic culture and that, all decisions for Indian Airlines have to be made by Indians for Indians. Um, that being said, it just seems like some decisions that are being made kind of happen for all sorts of random reasons. And in that rhetoric, it just, if I were Indigo, why would I just not stick with the narrow body model? Why not just rely on the A321 to fulfill its longer flight duration aspirations?
Well, I think there's two problems, right? So first, it's worth calling out that the Indigo and Turkish sort of relationship is pretty distinct from and different from the wet leasing that they're doing to grow generalized wide body operations, right? So I think the long run plan for Indigo is always like it is right with that sort of fleet of A350-900s to use wide body aircraft to fly international long haul sectors, right? Like that is their plan. And the wet lease 787s and other aircraft are simply a means to get that going faster as they wait for supply chains to catch up from a deliveries perspective. So they have 6 787s that they wet leased from North Atlantic. That's very much a temporary solution until their 60 A350-900s are delivered.
Okay.
I think beyond that, though, right? Like, so the Turkish Airlines relationship is different. What's happening there is, I think, closer to what you see happening with Virgin Australia's return to long haul operations, quote unquote, right? Indigo has valuable bilateral air service rights as an Indian carrier that it can tap into. And for certain countries that have caps, Turkey being one of those with amongst the most stringent sort of seat caps, there's far more demand for flights to and from Istanbul into that sort of hub that Turkish Airlines has there than they have rights to fly into the country of India and rights to operate seats in the country of India. And because the way the Indian government has historically assigned bilateral rights and air service agreements, right, which is tied to how much are Indian airlines using capacity relative to the cap, right? That's often been a governor, right, because they try to be protective of India's carriers for better or for worse. Turkey has been stuck for a very, very long time with very limited access to the Indian market. Like if you look at Turkish Airlines' Indian operations, I'll pull that up in a second. It's far sort of smaller than the sort of demand that they would have if they were able to kind of fly that. And so the
Makes
Indigo lease of the 777s is a workaround to get extra Turkish Airlines capacity into, and Indigo is basically leasing out its sort of charter essentially to enable Turkish Airlines to fly additional capacity into India, right? Like that's really all that's happening there.
So these like offensive moves, right? I mean, because I'm seeing like South Asian, you have India's fully privatized. just thinking about that Pakistan is so 75% of the stake in their flag carrier. But that's
Which
more
is also in
defensive
bed with
because they're
Turkish
losing.
too. Also,
Yeah.
not to interrupt,
So
but
how?
isn't like that? That's ironic. Go ahead. Sorry, Helvin. Continue.
No, yeah. But that's my point. Now that India's fully privatized, what's the relationship with the government in terms of regulations? And is that something that you are mentioning or you pointing out, Vinay?
Yeah, I think that protecting Indian carriers is a distinct motion from protecting sort of the state-owned flag carrier, but it still has kind of the same valence, right? Like I think from a regulatory perspective, right, the fact that these carriers are now privatized does mean that there's a little bit more of an arm's length relationship. Though ever since liberalization and ever since India's skies really liberalized in the early 2000s, I do think that you've seen more and more of an arm's length regulatory structure, but there's plenty of regulatory capture in a developing country like India. So it's not neither here nor there. I do think that the protection of Indian carriers and implicitly sort of Indian jobs, quote unquote, by trying to limit competition from foreign carriers that offer stronger connectivity or a stronger product. But India is not alone in that. Canada has that restriction on Emirates and Etihad, for example, right? And on Turkish Airlines, if I'm not mistaken, right? Australia has similar types of restrictions on certain sort of Middle Eastern carriers and on Qatar, especially, right? Qatar Airways has extremely limited access to the Australian market, which is why, you have
They flew
Virgin
to
Australia
Adelaide or
operating.
something.
They flew to Adelaide so they could get extra capacity into Melbourne. This is why you have Virgin Australia shut down its long haul operations during COVID, brought them back with basically two flights to and from Doha operated by Qatar Airways, wet lease Qatar Airways jets, right? Then in the other direction, you have Indonesia limiting the amount of capacity that Australian carriers can fly into and out of Bali, right? Because that's a market where Australian sort of point of sale dominates, right? So
Yeah.
again, this is not the freedoms of the air are always an interesting sort of sight to behold, because open skies is very much kind of the US default, but it is very much not the sort of global default, right? In terms of how individual countries manage their air travel rights. I do want to come back to Indigo, though. One question that you asked that I think we left unanswered was, why are they going to wide bodies and shifting off of their sort of narrow body only fleet approach? Well, I mean, first things first, right? Originally, right, they were an A320 family only operation. They were an A320 line, right? So A320, A320neo only operation. And then they added to that by bringing on the ATR 72 to fly regional routes within India. And then they added to that by adding on the A321neo to sort of grow capacity. And so first and foremost, Indigo has already added more complexity to its fleet than it historically had by moving across the A320 family into different types, as well as by bringing on the ATR 72s, right? So it's not the first new fleet type that's being introduced. Obviously, wide body operations carry some additional complexity. The bigger thing, though, and this is one of the hidden undercurrents of what happened in 2025 in aviation, is that the A321 XLR and the A320neo family more broadly, they have some issues of their own, right? It kind of flies under the radar because the 737 MAX has been a flaming dumpster fire of a perpetual news story. But the A321 XLR isn't meeting its range targets, right? And so if you look at kind of what the promised range was for the A321 XLR, right, according to sort of the press documentation, right, 4,700 nautical miles, the real world sort of range has come in a lot lower than that. Sub 4,000 is kind of what most people are seeing in terms of real effective real world range. And so that really changed.
What did they boast that it could go?
Up to 4,700 nautical miles, right? Now,
And
obviously, I think that was.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, and what are they encountering? That the range is more like 4,600
No, more
or
like
44.
4,000 ish.
No,
Oh, that's a big variance.
Or sub 4,000, right? Like
Wow.
3,900.
By
right?
the way, did you see the I call it the China surge? The orders for the A320s from Chinese airlines these past few days.
No more Comac.
I mean, obviously these are narrow bodies, but they're they didn't specify the variant. didn't say it was XLRs or anything. But
Well, it
I don't
seems like
know.
the C919 hasn't quite completely sapped demand for the 737 and the A320 just yet. And I'm sure there will be a 737 MAX order forthcoming as kind of the tariff wars continue to heat up. But just going back to that on Indigo, right? If you look at the kinds of markets that Indigo wants to serve, as you get deeper into Western Europe, right? So, just looking at the numbers here, right? So Delhi to London Heathrow is, let's use sort of nautical miles here. Delhi to London Heathrow is 3,600 nautical miles. So that's still workable with the sort of structure in place. But Mumbai to Manchester, right, which is one of the routes that Indigo has launched with their new 787, is close to 4,000 nautical miles. It's basically outside of the true real world effective range of the A321 XLR. So for Indigo's ambitions to grow in the largest international markets, even if you set aside the US, which I do think is part of the longer run roadmap, they need wide bodies. And the minute they need wide bodies, yeah, they could wait till A350s get delivered, but that's a extended backlog. Who knows how long it is until they get a meaningful sort of a critical mass of A350s delivered. And until they get those delivered, the 787s are a stopgap sort of temporary measure with the wet lease.
So you want to go to Australia, right? Also, maybe with those.
Australia as well. Most of East Asia kind of stays within range, right? But if you draw a map, right? And I think really Mumbai is kind of the interesting one, right? Because so the way that India's geography works, Delhi, because Indian carriers don't have sort of Russian airspace restrictions,
And there's the
tend
Himalayas too, right? Like like those mountains and those mountain ranges
And the
create a
US,
lot.
that's why I say they're offensive, man. They want to.
and Pakistani airspace as well, right?
In
Don't forget
Pakistan
that.
airspace. Yep.
Right. So for Mumbai, right? Like let's just say you want to kind of operate sort of a routing ex Mumbai, meaningful portions of Western Europe, including sort of Ireland, the UK, are all cut off if you kind of draw a 3,900 nautical mile radius at Mumbai, right? And then if you draw a 3,900 nautical mile radius at Delhi, right? It's the difference between sort of being able to serve Lisbon and Madrid go out of range when they would be in range. And then Bangalore in particular, I think is kind of interesting, right? Because it's in the southernmost sort of tip of India, you actually end up cutting off large swaths of Europe. In fact, most of Western Europe isn't reachable with an A321 XLR. And so to the degree that most of Europe isn't reachable with an A321 XLR, I think what you sort of see is that's why Indigo has sort of leaned towards the adding wide bodies to the fleet.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, just to close.
Fascinating.
Yeah, that was fascinating. Just to close that chapter, so in terms of India, I mean, 2025 kind of marred what you would hope was going to happen with.
It was a pretty mid-year for India aviation, as the
But
millennials like to say.
exactly, but it's it's a very exciting market, regardless, and we hope to see interesting things happen next year and the years to come.
And kind of
Yeah.
shifting, and continuing our narrative about 2025 winners and losers, I think that's where the Middle East and the Saudi airlines need to kind of come into the fray, particularly Saudi, right? We see here that the Saudi Arabia record passenger volumes continued. Previously, I thought, Saudi Arabia is all about Jeddah, right? Jeddah being an entry point for Hajj, Umrah, traffic to Medina and Makkah. And now it's Riyadh. Riyadh is really where it's happening. And Riyadh Air, in particular, is going to become the new national airline of Saudi Arabia. The Emirates, the Qatar, the Turkish, the Etihad, that is bringing in people to Saudi Arabia as part of Mohammed bin Zayed's policy to be able to get more tourism traffic into Saudi, and also to be able to position the kingdom to be another UAE, Qatar, Turkey, whatever. And we have Delta that's going to be launching flights to Riyadh from Atlanta. That's been announced already. Riyadh Air has now announced that it's going to start flying to London Heathrow. And I don't know the relationship between Saudi and India to be able to discuss more about the airspace access, but Saudi has typically flown to Delhi and to Mumbai and to other major airports, the distance is rather long compared to like, the UAE and Qatar. It's more of like a 5, 6 hour journey. However, there's also been a lot of existing traffic, like I said, that is there for Hajj and Umrah traffic that also extends to Pakistan, into Bangladesh, into other Muslim countries that exist within South Asia. And with Saudi and Saudi's role that it's going to play, I think it's going to become much more of a Jeddah focused hub. Um, it already pretty much is very Jeddah, although it does also have a lot of Riyadh action. And other airlines, that exist in the Saudi airspace, like you have Fly that is part of the low cost sector. You have some of the Arabian airlines like Fly Dubai, Air Arabia. They kind of bring in people to the subcontinent as well. But Riyadh Air is really wanting to be considered up there with Etihad, Qatar, and Emirates.
Well, they're all winners, right? Emirates, Qatar, Singapore, like just the Middle East region in
Yeah, I mean, I
general.
think the better question is who was a loser in Middle Eastern aviation in 2025, right? Like pretty much everyone had a gangbusters year when it comes to profitability. Maybe Oman Air is who you could call
Yeah,
out as being sort of like the loser in that they
they had to
sort
give
of
back a lot
had
of planes.
yep, and they sort of had ambitions at one point to turn Muscat into a Doha, Abu Dhabi, Istanbul style connecting hub. Obviously not at the same scale, but they had those ambitions at sort of one point. Um, but they sort of ran into a buzzsaw in a way,
How?
right?
What happened to them?
I think, well, for a couple of things, right? So at one point, right, like Etihad had sort of like wavered on its kind of global domination strategy, right, on kind of running the Qatar and Emirates playbook, and they seem to have shifted back into the sort of posture of how do we turn Abu Dhabi into a Dubai Light or a Dubai Mini.
They had the Swiss Air Hunter strategy
Right
version
when they
of the mid aughts, where they had radial
exactly.
alliances to grow market share with failing airlines like Alitalia, um, Air Dolomiti, Air Berlin, LOL, Virgin Australia, among others.
Yeah. So so basically, right, like they had that sort of ambition, right, to kind of like sneak in there while Etihad had taken its eye off the ball. So I think Etihad's sort of return. I think Saudia has become sort of more aggressive about about trying to capture connecting traffic. I think sort of Emirates and Qatar's continued growth has sucked oxygen out of the room, and Muscat just doesn't have the same sort of raw demand or connectivity, right? It doesn't have kind of the inbound business or tourist demand, even to the level of a place like Doha or like Dubai, nor does it have the sort of connectivity to drive connecting passenger volumes, right? Um, and so the combination of those two things meant that they sort of tried and failed to kind of turn Muscat into It's a beautiful airport. It's a great facility to connect through. But one of the reasons it's a great facility to connect through is that there's way more capacity than there are passengers flying through there, right? And this was true for me even in 2022, which is when I flew through Muscat on Oman Air on my way from Asia back to the Middle East. This was true even back then, and their ambitions have only shrunk since then. One other just side note that I think is absolutely hilarious. So if you look forward to July of 2026, Saudia has the exact same number of daily departures planned from both Jeddah and Riyadh, right? 135 and 135. Now, Jeddah is much more sort of long haul. There's bigger planes and they fly further. But when it comes to just sort of total operations, like total daily flights, those two hubs are scheduled for the exact same number of flights on July 7th, kind of peak summer 2026. Now, the one caveat there, right, is if you sort of look at kind of medium and long haul flying, right, you look at flights over 2,000 miles, 2,000 statute miles. There's about 3 times as many flights of that length from Jeddah as there are from Riyadh. So Riyadh is much more of a regional operation for Saudia,
Mhm.
and Jeddah is much more of a sort of
So
long
what
haul.
about so what about like, the petroleum based things? We have Saudi Aramco that's been around forever. Previously, if you go on some of the old historical airline um fan sites that look at like route maps from the 80s and 90s, you see routes to Dhahran and to Dammam, right? Those are still being serviced, I believe. But, they obviously, when people think aviation in Saudi Arabia, their immediate ones are to Medina, to Jeddah, and to Riyadh, for example.
Right.
Where do
Well,
those,
so
other
Speaking of Saudi,
and Dammam now share an airport, right? So that's
we're
part
gonna
of what
see a
happened
comedy
there.
show next year in Saudi because American comedians are going. Well, everyone's going. Yeah. It's like big in Saudi. Yeah, big
Yeah.
in Jeddah.
I've seen
Yeah,
YouTube videos on like
weird.
these raves that happen in Jeddah. It's like, whoa. Like,
Crazy.
to sort of wrap up the Middle East and South Asia region, I think that we're going to continue to see strong representation from them, and I think that the ways in which you can see engage that is you're going to see reactions from the European airlines that have always taken place where they complain about they claim the state funded or the state sponsored airlines, but it's like Emirates are showing their balance sheets. They're bringing out the receipts. They're showing that they're profitably run airlines, and call it an advantage based on labor cost structure or infrastructure that seemingly, you don't have the London Heathrow runway issues, at Doha or at Dubai. So you have that happening, and these airlines are showing, that probably they're going to continue to invest in their products, and you're going to continue to see the U.S. and Canadian airlines partner with them. Whereas 10 years ago, it was like the U.S. and the European Union, including the U.K., was anti-Middle East. Now you have those partnerships between Delta. I mean, Delta is partnering with Riyadh Air and
Yeah.
Saudia. And then I think the last thing about the Middle East that we can't forget is even the Levant region, or North Africa for that matter, is showing some growth. Egypt Air has announced intentions to serve Chicago and LA. They previously served LA. And then Royal Jordanian is coming to Dallas Fort Worth. They're bringing on 787-9s. Less so from El Al and Middle East Airlines for obvious reasons, geopolitical tensions. But yeah, I mean, I think that that's kind of the wrap up on the Middle East.
Today's episode is brought to you by Thai Airways International. Here are a few quick facts about this proud carrier. Founded in 1960 and operating out of Bangkok, Thai Airways is national flag carrier of Thailand and a founding member of the Star Alliance. Headquartered in Suvarnabhumi Airport, it connects Thailand to destinations worldwide and is renowned for its signature Thai hospitality and service philosophy. The airline is preparing to launch its brand new Airbus A321neo fleet, entering service later this year with lie-flat business class seats, refreshed cabins, and the latest cabin technology. Whether you're planning a business trip, beach escape, or a connection into Thailand's long-haul network, keep an eye out for the A321neo. Thai Airways, smooth as silk.
I want to switch over to a couple of topics on the Americas side. Specifically, I want to delve into three, which we can go in succession, then wrap up our 2025 summaries and then move over into 2026. Actually, four topics. So the first one being Spirit Airlines and essentially it being on life support. The second is Aeromexico and Delta and the JV collapse, basically, the lawsuits that have taken place with the U.S. Department of Justice and Transportation. The third being Canada, the Canadian fallout from the tariffs and the whole issues that have taken place with Canadian aviation. And then the fourth topic being Alaska-Hawaiian merger and how, the whole shakeup that will take place across Hawaiian and Alaska's network synergies will go into effect. We see a Seattle hub that's also now going to stretch into Portland, Anchorage, Honolulu, and San Diego, less SF and LAX. How does that sound, y'all? All right,
Sounds good.
let's start with Spirit.
Especially because I flew like this December, I flew JetBlue instead of Spirit down in Florida because I usually just take from Fort Lauderdale to Tampa to visit my mother. I just take but no, JetBlue from New York to Florida. I love JetBlue, so I don't know why I would ever want to fly Spirit again. That's my type.
For a big front seat?
I mean, it's the same price, but you get all the perks, right? On JetBlue.
You get those sweet, sweet United miles when you fly JetBlue these days, thanks to the Blue
Yeah,
Sky partnership.
exactly.
Yeah. I mean,
Not much else, but you do get United miles.
yeah, Blue
Mhm.
Sky, not the Twitter version, but the United JetBlue version will be a thing. And I think that, sub conversations with there include the JetBlue Mint Light, is it called? Where they're adding
Mini
that
Mint, I think, is
Mini
sort of
Mint.
moniker that they're using for it.
Mini Mint. Southwest Airlines assigned seating. Alaska, will they do, live flats on transcons, right?
And shout out to JetBlue. I shouted them out. It's like, oh, had a great time working, editing, and they shouted back on social media. So hey, that was great.
Yeah. I mean, JetBlue's always been woke, however, I still want to figure out a way to use my 70,000 True Blue points that I've been accumulating since 2017 to fly Mint. But I think that I'm just going to hit up one of I have a friend who's a flight attendant based in Chicago for JetBlue. And so I'm just going to use his benefits to fly JetBlue transatlantic and hopefully get Mint. I mean, my gosh, there cannot be, and I know this is a sidebar and we're getting off topic, but you cannot tell me that with all the transatlantic capacity that's coming out of JetBlue from Boston and JFK to Europe, that there are going to be seats available from Boston to Amsterdam in Mint that are available for non-rev employee travel.
Maybe
Just
they'll change
saying.
that. JetBlue, just listen to Rohan for 2026.
Helwing, do you think that Spirit? Well, go ahead.
Yeah. No, just wanted to, and you can continue because that's my comment on Spirit talking about JetBlue. Do they need to change their whole? What? I don't know. I don't know what to say.
Spirit has been given a lifeline of only $30 million, which is not that much if you're American or Delta, but it could be a lifeline for them to get through the holidays. I personally think that the Spirit Frontier merger will happen. That is the only way that Spirit's assets, real estate, labor, and honestly, business model is going to have any future. I'm really a bit saddened because I had an affair with Spirit in 2015. I flew them a lot and they were so good to me when I figured out how it was done. I'm too scared to fly on Frontier. I haven't done it yet. I feel like I flew them a long time ago in 2003 and then again in 2008 before they became a fully unbundled. I have a feeling that like a piranha is going to come out of my seat and just like bite me in the butt. So no Frontier for me, even though they fly out of O'Hare and Midway, but I just feel like I'm going to get scammed. But that's going to happen. We saw the Barry Biffle departure take place. A lot of these decisions come at a CEO level. And so I believe that, to close the Spirit Frontier, conversation, I think that's what's going to happen to Spirit.
That's gonna happen. Okay.
With regards to Mexico and Canada, I think that can be sort of discussed in a simple sentence, which is that is a byproduct of administration related impact. We've been in this podcast now, we're going on our 10th year, 11th year, I think, in 2026, where we have said between the Trump administration, the Biden administration, and once again the Trump administration, these kind of butting of heads and differing of opinions with the DOJ and the DOT over what is considered fair and equitable competition on trans-border routes. It's like oil and water, and that's why we're seeing.
Yeah, but I think the Canadian market and the Mexican market are pretty distinct, right? In that the Canadian market,
yes,
more to the point, right? Like that
umbrella,
the politics
over
of what's
both.
happening in the Canadian market is pretty sort of unidirectional, meaning that Canadian demand for flights to the U.S. has been pretty foundationally impacted and sapped by a variety of tensions, largely driven by some of the tariff action and the bluster coming out of sort of the U.S. White House. In the Mexican case, it's a little different, right? Because the sort of combination of AMLO and the Sheinbaum government and the Mexican government at both the Mexico City level and at the sort of like national level fundamentally broke the plan to build a new Mexico City airport, then tried to play a bunch of games with sort of airline access to Mexico City.
Reinventing Mexicana.
Right.
Seriously.
And sort of trying to force airlines into NLU, into their white elephant, right? Their Mirabelle, as it were, or their Malpensa. The
Yeah,
Malpensa is
that's
actually a pretty successful airport these days,
Haifa, Santa
but they're
Lucia.
yeah.
They can't even
yeah.
figure out a name for the Mexico City airport.
Yeah, that was
So I think that those are a little different, right? In
airport.
Mexico's case, it very much takes two to tango, and a lot of the chaos here has sort of emerged from that. I did think that the most important thing that happened in a Mexican context this year was the proposed merger between Viva and Volaris. Those two carriers
Yeah.
together control about
1,000%.
60% of the Mexican market, and outside of Mexico City, they're pretty dominant in Monterrey, in Tijuana, in Guadalajara, in pretty much every other major Mexican airport that matters. Viva and Volaris they dominate the market. The exceptions are Mexico City and Cancun, right? Cancun is dominated, frankly, by US carriers and by foreign carriers because a lot of the demand is from foreign countries. So
That was a
that
winner.
to me is kind of crazy, right? They're basically
Yeah.
asking for the Indian situation, right? Where a low cost carrier controls about 60% of the market, and then the full service former flag carrier, quote unquote, controls about 30% of the market. And
They're
then you have a bunch
still
of Captain
using
Hogs.
they're still using Indian Airlines' calling sign.
Yeah.
AIC. It's
Yeah.
it's wild. On the topic of mergers too, on the other side of the border, we've seen that there have also been some failed merger efforts, even on the Canadian side, between Air Transit and Air Canada, WestJet, and another airline. I mean, those things never
They
were.
just Canada. I don't know what Canadian and just ended a code share with Latam.
Yeah,
Or
possibly.
am I wrong? Yeah.
Yeah,
But
I
maybe
mean,
that's not
yeah, I mean, it will remain interesting to see, if the Viva Volaris thing, goes through. But to wrap up kind of the Americas, let's finish with Alaska. And I think that, we've not even touched the tip of the iceberg of 2025 yet. I think we've done all an amazing job of covering these topics. So, with the remaining 10 minutes we have, we want to go to 2026 predictions. But perhaps, gentlemen, let's finish with Alaska and Hawaiian. How does that sound? For our 2025 recap. So basically, saw that Alaska and Seattle and the battle for Seattle with Delta, that's going to continue to be a thing. Alaska has obviously announced long haul routes that it will fly out of Seattle, including with those 787-9s that are going to be Alaska branded. And those were intended to go to Hawaiian. Honolulu as a hub is kind of being de emphasized and maybe even re optimized, which even as an inter-airline hub, will that be the benefit of Southwest? And then there's discussions about Anchorage and San Diego as um, and Portland, for that matter, as kind of areas of focus, and even Idaho, like Boise in the Mountain West, because there's a lot of growth
So
in those regions.
Boise has actually fallen a bit back, right? Like, so at one point they were growing a little bit more sort of aggressively in Boise, right? But pretty fundamentally, and we talked about this in our last episode, I believe, maybe it was the Alaska episode a few months ago. Um, SFO and LAX, kind of the sort of the carcass of Virgin America, is being drawn down specifically to fund growth. In Portland's case, it's restoring Portland to some of its pre-pandemic sort of connectivity as that sort of secondary hub in the Pacific Northwest. In San Diego's case, it's picking a battle with Southwest, but with a very, very specific I think, strategic vision in mind, right? The best case I've heard for San Diego, beyond just generally, hey, it's a good market, Southwest is a more vulnerable competitor than it used to be, given the shift away, to bag fees, to assigned seating, right? They're less differentiated. All that's fair. But the other thing that's worth calling out in San Diego is they just got a bunch of new terminal capacity online with the rebuilding of Terminal 1. And on top of this, and I think this is the even bigger factor, that is a very capacity constrained airport. If you ask me to predict which airport in the United States would be next to get slot controls, my honest prediction would probably be San Diego, because obviously LaGuardia, JFK, Newark, right, there's kind of the slot controls there. O'Hare now has enough runway capacity, more constrained by gates. Same with LAX. DFW's got plenty of space. Denver's got plenty of space. Houston, right, so on and so forth. So really the next airport that is constrained by its runway capacity, but bursting at the seams, is San Diego, with the sort of single runway operation, the kind of tight ATC corridors that you have to fly into and out of because the airport is so close to downtown, the inability to kind of add a second runway without sort of having to eminent domain and or demolish and or buy tens of billions of dollars of very valuable real estate. plus California NIMBYism and environmental quote unquote regulation, right? Like there's a world where in 2030 San Diego has slot controls, right?
Yeah.
And in that world, the way that slot controls typically get sort of established is based on sort of the established traffic patterns at the moment of the sort of application of slot controls. That's typically what gets assigned to airlines, right? And so materially, let's say San Diego gets capped at whatever, 400, 500 daily flights, depending on kind of what the right number ends up being. If Alaska's at 150 flights or 200 flights, those then become very, very valuable in a world where San Diego gets slot controlled. So I thought that was actually kind of the most interesting sort of look, right? Because in Portland, what they're really doing is they're using sort of the drawdown of Seattle, of SFO and LAX flying. It was very unprofitable for Alaska, frankly, right? Probably the least profitable part of their operation, to help sort of fund kind of a restoration of Portland capacity and connectivity to its pre-pandemic levels. But I think San Diego is definitely the most interesting thing that Alaska is doing or did in 2026. So
It's a good year for the merger. It was not a bad, maybe not as. I mean, I think if just going back to what we're talking about, America isn't going to get its act together. I mean, Hawaiian going into joining One World next year, that's going to be good for them because you got some feeder traffic from American and other partners going to Honolulu and whatnot.
Yeah.
That's going to be nice.
Yeah. So what are our thoughts on the Anchorage hub, the Honolulu hub, and if there's, okay, no SFO as much, or LAX is going to be focused on just kind of O&D, similar to like a New York JFK, right? With American Airlines that has, routes to places like Loreto, Mexico, and Guadalajara, Guatemala, because, those make money, but you can't do LAX to Boston or LAX to JFK on Alaska. Um, what about a San Jose hub, right? Will San Jose be the alternative to San Francisco, or is San Diego's the alternative to LAX?
I think San Diego is a distinct market from LAX. I think San Jose sort of kind of waxed and waned in their commitment to San Jose. They are a good deal smaller than they were sort of at their peak in San Jose, right? Just kind of like looking at sort of what this looked like for them in sort of summer of 2026. If you look at what they're doing from San Jose, they have 22 flights a day to Boise, Honolulu, Niue, Maui, Portland, San Diego, Seattle. It's basically the hubs plus sort of Hawaiian service to Lihue and then service to Boise. Now, flashback to 2019, right? You sort of go back to kind of the pre-pandemic sort of window, and you kind of look at a similar sort of period back in 2019. They were they're about 2 times the size, and they had a bunch of additional destinations. They had service to Austin, Burbank, the
Plus left
short-lived service
field.
to Dallas Love, Newark, Guadalajara, JFK, Kona, Payne Field, Reno, right? So Cabo, John Wayne, Orange County, and even Tucson, right? So they have very much shifted from sort of a focus city in San Jose to essentially a spoke operation with a couple of point-to-point flights to Hawaii, right? And that sort of makes sense, right? Because if you sort of play back the history here, right? Alaska started to make a push into California post the Virgin America merger, right? And in addition to their sort of SFO and LAX sort of acquired hubs, they layered in essentially a bet at San Jose and a bet at San Diego that those would be sort of good markets for them to grow into. And where we landed is that San Jose didn't really work, but San Diego has worked like gangbusters, right?
Hmm.
I think that comes down to the fact that there is no legacy carrier that dominates in San Diego, right? That's historically been a Southwest stronghold, at least since the days of PSA. But San Jose, while it doesn't directly have a sort of legacy competitor, you do have sort of United as the 300-pound gorilla up the road. And so that combination, I think, meant that, and also some changes in travel patterns post-COVID for how Bay Area travel demand is sort of distributed, has I think really changed sort of This is really driven why San Jose didn't work anywhere near as well. And so that's what you see reflected in kind of what they do.
Yeah. And then let's finish on Anchorage and Honolulu, because I think we'll be hitting an hour, and maybe we can start 2026 with the predictions episode rather than try to fit that in with this one. How does that sound to y'all?
Yeah, sounds like
Sure.
a plan.
Okay. So last topic, the Alaska Hawaiian merger, and now Honolulu and Anchorage. We know we talked about it a little bit on the last episode. I think we talked a lot about Hawaii and then Honolulu. Maybe we can talk about Alaska and Anchorage.
I mean, like, we're still talking about the same. Like, you're talking about the hub, right? Because yeah, I mean, just to finish, Hawaii and Alaska, they're gonna fly a whole
They've
year
added
with the same.
JFK, for
That
example.
just, hey,
Well,
same
they might add
certificate.
Boston. Um,
I
you know,
need to go to.
will
That is just so interesting.
will Alaska, be able to maybe even fly 737 Maxes from Anchorage to Tokyo? Um, will they be able to fly them from Anchorage to Reykjavik, or from Anchorage seasonally to Europe in the summer? Is there demand for that? Right? There are demand patterns for Condor to fly to like Whitehorse, Canada, and um other markets. Like, will Anchorage all of a sudden be reconnected to Asia, to Europe, like it was previously as a stopover point between Europe and Asia, East
Yeah.
Europe?
Yeah. I think that's a little ambitious. You seem to be ascribing New Pacific's quote unquote
Maybe not
business
Tokyo.
plan
I come from the
to
airliners.net school of network
yeah.
planning, and the simplifying college of how to run an
Throw it,
airline.
right.
Yeah.
Just throw everything
But
at
Using AI.
I do think that pretty genuinely, kind of in the post pandemic sort of window, you've seen a real step up in terms of sort of demand for service um, to the lower 48, right? So if you look back to, I always love kind of looking at sort of what things look like pre pandemic and post pandemic. So you look back sort of pre pandemic, you look post pandemic. Alaska is about 33% larger in terms of available seat miles from its Anchorage hub, and about 20% larger in terms of departing flights, right? So about 60, they went from about 50 to 60 daily departures, 52 to 64 rather, but they went from 9 million available seat miles, or 9 billion available seat miles, to 12 billion available seat miles for a single day, right? So they're about 33% larger in terms of seat. And part of what's happening there is that the surface area of sort of lower 48 service from Anchorage has grown pretty exponentially, right? So prior to the pandemic, right? So 2019, kind of the peak summer right before the pandemic, you had service to LAX, Chicago O'Hare, Portland, and Seattle, right? That was kind of the sum total of Alaska service in from nonstop from Anchorage to the lower 48, right? And a lot of that sort of traffic was historically designed to flow through um, the sort of Seattle and Portland hubs. When you look post pandemic, the story's completely different. So you've got service to Boise, Boston, Denver, Spokane, New York JFK, Las Vegas, LAX, Minneapolis, Chicago, Portland, Phoenix, San Diego, Seattle, SFO, Salt Lake City, and Sacramento. So it's just completely different in terms of the service pattern. The Alaskan operation has stayed the inter-Alaska operation has stayed pretty stable. There's kind of been an explosion, and now not all these flights are daily, right? Some of them are even, I believe, Saturday only service, right? If you kind of look at it, or 2 or 3 times a week. But kind of the net result of this is you have way more sort of nonstop service to the lower 48 than you did pre-pandemic. And that's reflective of demand. So Anchorage, I think, has a pretty bright future in a way, because there's lots of kind of the post-COVID premium leisure sort of chasing after new destinations trend has benefited international travel to Southern Europe and now to Asia in kind of a delayed manner. But it has also benefited Alaska within the United States. Honolulu, on the other hand, I think is sort of in a more interesting place, in that I do think that you will see Honolulu get drawn down over time, right? It's just hard for it not to, because part of the sort of logic for why you buy the for why you buy Hawaiian Airlines is to get access to wide bodies to build a global hub in Seattle. right? And so, if you look sort of pre-pandemic, Hawaiian was about 120 sort of kind of daily departures, right? Whatever, so 155 million weekly ASMs, right? And that sort of reminds me that I think I misquoted million as billion in my discussion of the Anchorage statistics. You look, meanwhile, at sort of 2026, and Alaska is down about 15 flights a day, and sort of down in terms of ASM volume, right? So basically, sort of Honolulu is about 20% smaller in terms of flights. And if you were to sort of add Alaska and Hawaiian back together, let me just do that math real quick. I'm sure this makes for scintillating podcasting. Sort of, it's about 10% smaller in terms of ASMs, right? Now, obviously, some of that is the function of they're flying more to the United States. They're flying a little bit less sort of frequency on inter-island routes. But sort of net, Honolulu has been treading water, and I think it continues to tread water as they look to build out more and more of the Seattle long-haul route portfolio. And then eventually, why not Portland and San Diego, right? Like, Portland and San Diego absolutely could probably support an Alaska nonstop to at least to London, if nowhere else. And especially if they end up in the sort of transatlantic joint venture, you could see over time even additional service beyond.
Yeah. And we can talk about that in our 2026 predictions podcast, which you can release in early 2026. So,
I mean, we have hinted a few predictions.
we've hinted
in
a
this
few
episode.
predictions. Yeah.
Yeah.
And,
but you'll have to listen to the
one
first
last thing,
episode of
though.
2026 to actually get those predictions.
Yeah, exactly. One last thing though, too quick. The OEMs. I'm glad to see Embraer picking up some traction. Embraer, it's pretty cool. I love them. And well, the two kaijus, I guess, the two behemoths. Boeing, I think they paid a piper like Apple, and so they are kind of like you do you. Airbus, I think, has some delays. I mean, I guess Boeing safety issues. They have to, make sure they keep working on that. But besides that, I don't see anything new happening with them. Not much to say about this year.
yeah.
Well, I think very
all right.
quietly we did call out the notion of the sort of geared turbofan, right? So it's an OEM, an engine OEM, but that has slowly sort of percolated and turned into a cluster, right? Hundreds and hundreds of Pratt & Whitney geared turbofan powered planes, both from the sort of artist formerly known as the C series and the A320neo family, are grounded sort of worldwide. And that is that's part of those supply chain issues that we talked about. It's impacting capacity very substantially for airlines that have kind of invested heavily in the GTF. Arguably was a non-trivial factor in sort of some of Spirit's woes, some of JetBlue's woes. Nigo's having trouble with it. Lots and lots of carriers are having trouble with it. And that's the thing, right? Is like sort of Boeing's missteps with the 737 MAX have almost provided air cover for the sort of trash heap steaming dumpster fire, right?
Right.
That has turned into in its own right.
I mean, that's probably been what has brought Spirit Airlines to its knees.
Yeah.
On that vein, y'all, I have to jump. My family's waiting for me to have dinner with them. If y'all want to keep discussing, feel free to do so. But I'm so grateful that we continued this podcast in 2025 and that, we had our 10th year celebration. We're going to look forward to Yeah, but thank you for another wonderful season. We're halfway through, I guess, of season 9, and it's been wonderful to talk to you guys. I could talk to you all day. I just probably need a few more calories in my system to keep going.
Well, happy holidays, happy new year, Rohan. Thank you for this year. Great conversations, and they will continue for sure. So,
happy new year, buddy.
Happy New Year to you too.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for listening to us this year and hopefully next year. Any shout outs, Vinay?
No, just shout out to all of our listeners. Remember to leave us a like or a rating, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. And we'll see you all in 2026.
Yes. And if you'd like to sponsor our podcast, you can write us at, write me at helwing at airwaysmag.com. That's HELWING at airwaysmag.com. So thank you very much, and see you in the next episode next year of the Airways podcast.